Okay, guys, so we're back again to talk a little bit about Japanese-American internment during World War II. And internment, don't get it confused. If you inter somebody, you bury them, but if you intern somebody, you confine them. And this is about camps that were not Nazi concentration camps and death camps, but they were related. They were in the same family. They were cousins. And here you see kind of an epitome of what went on. Here are young kids born in the United States. They're Japanese Americans. They have parents who may or may not have been born in the United States. Given their ages, which look like maybe in their 20s or 30s, probably were, and their parents were the immigrants from Japan. So these people are American citizens by one or two generations. They have an American flag, they're very patriotic, and yet they're on a train being taken inland to what, when you see pictures of it, you will say, yep, that's a concentration camp. Internment camps is what we called them. Probably the worst example of racial intolerance in World War II was this. The black-white race riots because of African-American workers in northern factories, and the Zoot Suit riots in the Southwest were terrible. Yes, this is a government program and was potentially much more uprooting in its time. You can see here he's packed up and be ready to be taken off to camp as well. It was feared that Japanese Americans were disloyal to the United States and in fact were loyal to Japan. This was not something that we accused German Americans of routinely, and we didn't because of the obvious reason. German Americans are Euro Americans. When European Americans, English Americans from the British Isles, from Europe, are the majority of the population, and German Americans ethnically fit right in. Indistinguishable when Mr. Schicklgruber walks down the street. But when Mr. Yoshido walks down the street, this is an Asian person. We're at war with Japan. This is someone to be distrusted. It's visual and it's very emotional. And so in February of 1942, FDR issues another famous or infamous Executive Order 9066, which allows for certain people, citizens, to be moved at military discretion to other places from war zones, military areas in the United States, by which they mean they want to strip the coast of people that they fear to be somehow in cahoots with the Japanese in Japan. This is a very famous picture as well. It's by the very famous photographer Dorothea Lange. We saw some of her Great Depression photos when we were doing the Great Depression. This is the Moshida family. They're lined up, ready to get on the train. They've got their name tags on. They've got their worldly possessions with them. They're in their Sunday best clothes. Dad and his oldest son looking very much alike. And the chilling thing is that you can leaf through and find pictures of Polish families on the train station platform in Warsaw getting ready to be put on cars and taken to Auschwitz. These people are not being taken to a death camp. That's not what we did. But the idea, the mindset of getting these people out of here and putting them in a camp where they can not do us any harm is a similar kind of fear. Japs keep moving. This is a white man's neighborhood. So you can see the idea. Barbed wire and chain link fence to confine the Japanese Americans. And here you can see the racial nature, ethnic nature of the political cartoons. This is Jap Alley. And Uncle Sam's got a piece of wood with a nail on it. He's going to get rid of all these Japanese cats, but there's These alley cats, there's many, many of them. Maybe only alley cats, but jeepers, a hell of a lot of them. And you can see they want to strip the coasts of Washington, Oregon, California of these Japanese people who you can see are depicted signaling over to Japan. Like I said, you can see it's very concentration camp looking, isn't it, out there in the middle of the desert. Here, not so much concentration camp appearing because it's a racetrack. It's the Santa Anita racetrack in California where they moved the horses out, cleaned the stalls, and made apartments out of the individual box stalls, and Japanese American families lived in them during the war. Not a great place to live. Very famous book. You may have read it, or you would have had the opportunity to. Years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I think, we used to teach it in one of the grade levels in the middle school, Farewell to Manzanar. It was written by a lady who, in her married name, you can't necessarily discern her Japanese heritage. She's Jean Houston. But as a young girl, she spent some of her growing up years in this camp, Manzanar, and she has a very sensitive book about her experience, which is well worth the read. There's a not very good 1970s made-for-TV movie about it, but the book is well worth your time if you're interested in reading. I want to introduce you to a guy who is sort of becomes the poster child for all of this, is a guy by the name of Fred Korematsu. And Fred was one of the many Japanese Americans who got caught up in this in World War II. He was a Japanese American, that he was born here. Recordings of Fred talking sounds just like anybody from Huntsburg. It's not an accent. It's nothing like that. He was a shipyard worker. He had been given a promotion because he was such a good worker. He was going to be a foreman. Instead, when the order came down, he was fired from his job. And when the order came to round people up and put them on the train platform and take them away someplace, he took off. I'm not doing that. He was arrested. He was prosecuted for being a fugitive, and he was put in one of the camps, and he stayed in one of the camps, and he tried to buck it. He tried to sue the government, and it was upheld that he was a potential danger to the country. But decades later, it was overturned. So that whole story is kind of representative of this whole set of events. There you can see the Santa Anita box stalls as they're getting prepped to have Japanese Americans live in them. He refused to be put in a box stall, and he took off for Oakland, California, up the coast a little bit, and he was arrested on the street corner, and because he was recognized as Japanese, and he was held in jail in San Francisco, and he was going to be put in the camps. A representative of the American Civil Liberties Union came to him and said, "This is a violation of your civil rights as an American citizen. Do you want to contest this?" "Yeah, I do." And they did, but the government case was upheld. The case was called Korematsu versus the United States. There's young Fred. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided, looking at the facts that the government prosecutors presented and the defense, that it was bad, but it was justified as a military necessity. These people presented, we've talked about this before, a clear and present danger to the United States in time of war. Korematsu versus United States, 1944. Formed late in the war and after the war, there was a group still around called the Japanese-American Citizens League. And the Japanese-American Citizens League was formed to advocate for the rights of these exact people, and really all Japanese Americans. As part of that after the war, they took up Fred's old court case and began to re-examine all the documents and dig and dig and dig and do research. There's Fred in his later years. 1983, so talking 40 years later, more or less, they discovered that key documents that the government had been withheld from the court case by the government attorneys, hidden from the Supreme Court. Those documents said that the Japanese Americans were no threat to the United States. And in fact, some of the more patriotic people, some of the most gung-ho, ready to fight to defend their new homeland, their adopted homeland, were, I'm going the wrong way, am I? Stuff here. Had done some of the most to fight for their country. That's what the documents in the 1940s showed. There was no reason for this. They had already been put in the camps when the research came in, and so the documents were suppressed. There were no acts of treason of any kind by any Japanese American, and the case was reopened on the basis of government misconduct. It never actually went to trial. The trial was when the whole government case was dismissed. A second Korematsu versus the United States, 39 years after the first one, undid what had already been done. The conviction was overturned in federal court. It's a pivotal moment in civil rights history, not just for Asian Americans, not just for the Japanese Americans. 2010, I think Fred passed away, I want to say 8 or 9 years ago, so 2012 perhaps. But in 2010, the state of California passed Fred Korematsu Day, the first day in U.S. history named to honor Asian Americans in any way. The Japanese American League continued to try to help displaced World War II internees and their families, and also to pressure the government to kind of right the wrong, since it had now been shown that there was no basis for the internment. 1988, President Reagan apologized to all Japanese Americans and granted $20,000 to each survivor. And here he is signing the order to do that. And people have said, Americans have said, well, why pay them money? It was bad, but it's over. And the answer comes in the incarceration, the loss of freedom, right to life, liberty, and freedom, liberty and your property. Here, they're denied their freedom, and here, loss of property. Businesses were sold out from under people who were taken away to camps. Their personal possessions, like their cars, all were taken away. Sold. This is a Japanese-American grocery, has a big sold sign on it, and a big I'm an American, implying obviously that the Japanese-American owner is not an American. So there was $20,000, even in 1980 dollars, compared to 40 years later, was a smaller chunk of change than losing a business, a home, a car, and 2 or 3 years of your life, but it was an important gesture. 5 years later, 1993, on behalf of the government, President Clinton formally apologized to all Japanese Americans for this episode. But this was an episode that showed intolerance, yes, but especially the amount of terror and anxiety created by a war situation. This modern day coronavirus. Many people are going about their business. The government is taking due precautions, but there are some people who are very, 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 very fearful. This is not a war situation, but some of the passions that people have about it, it's easy to see how people would kind of lose their sense of perspective a little bit because of the clear and present danger to them and finding somebody else that they think they can associate with that danger. We've had episodes in the past 3 weeks in which Asian Americans, again, we're not necessarily sure if they're Chinese or not, have physically attacked Asian people because of the so-called China virus. It's not the same thing, but it gives you a little taste of the idea of how people kind of lose their perspective a little bit when something bad is going on around them. A bad episode in our history. All right.